Good evening, Europe. Good morning, America, and welcome to all. On behalf of the Order Malta, I would like to thank all speakers and participants for being with us today. A special thanks to the organizers, to Yves Reichenbach, webmaster, and to Karen Lee and Anna Street de Kirizouet, my assistants. We all wage an uphill battle against human trafficking, a scourge on the rise everywhere in the world, especially during this pandemic. No country is immune, and certainly we could do all more to combat and prosecute human trafficking. In the aftermath of the adoption of the Palermo Protocol, today we begin with the first of our 3 webinars on international prosecution of human trafficking. Our webinar today shall focus on the present situation, taking stock of the implementation of the Palermo Protocol 20 years after its adoption. If participants want to ask questions, they can use the Q&A, question and answer, and we shall answer their questions through our discussant, Mrs. Morgane Nicot. Today, we are very fortunate to welcome 4 distinguished speakers: Kevin Hyland, Olivia Smith, Brian Islin, and Morgane Nicot. And now, it is my great honor to give the floor to Kevin Hyland, Ireland representative to the Council of Europe Independent Group of Experts for Trafficking and senior advisor to the Santa Marta Group. Kevin, thank you very much for being with us tonight. You have the floor.
Thank you. And if you are hearing me now, I hope you are.
Yep.
Perhaps maybe the slides was causing the problem. So good to speak to you all around the world. And really, I think Olivia spoke of this in a very clear way. We have had for 20 years a commitment, and our commitment should not be any less than any other global commitment we have. And if we look at the extent of how the climate change has progressed and the commitment to end that, or to change the climate issues, we need to have the same resourcing and accountability attached to human trafficking and modern slavery. And when we look at the figures of 40 million people and 151 million children in labor exploitation or labor conditions that are unacceptable, we then start to realize the true magnitude of this issue. And this isn't something that's new. If we look, we have legislation and crimes and promises that go right back to 326 BC. And various times in the world, whether that was in the transatlantic slave trade or other times where there was a commitment that we would end this. But yet people and the commodification of people for cheap labor or for fun or for exploitation has continued. And now we're looking at a commercial enterprise that generates at least 150 billion US dollars a year. So with all these commitments, with UN protocols, Council of Europe, EU directives, and many other international commitments, why is it this crime continues? And we now see is expanding, and particularly with COVID. One of the big problems is the marginalized and the vulnerable have become more marginalized and more vulnerable, and it starts to reflect on us. We, as the current incumbents of this planet, have allowed this to happen. So we, as the current incumbents, have got the duty to end this. But that can't be done by words. It has to be done by action. So if we look at all the commitments around the world, all the legislation, all the policy that's there, we see, as I've said, we have the Council of Europe, we have EU directives, we have OSCE commitments and guidance, we have UN human rights, and we have the SDGs, we have the G20 commitment, we have the G7 commitments, and we have legislation in most countries in the world. But still, this is a prosperous crime. And if we took prosecutions, we often hear that you're not going to prosecute your way out of this. And I'm a former police officer, and I would accept that. Any serious crime issue, you need more than just prosecutions. You need to factor it out of your environment. But you do need to have prosecutions when you've got 40 million people in the world who are suffering. Because if you are making money, and there's nothing stopping you from making money out of the exploitation of people, you will continue. This isn't something that happens in isolation. It happens within serious and organized crime. And if we look at the convictions for 2019, which are the last figures available, we're talking about 9,548 convictions across the world. That's against 40 million victims. It hardly registers. And only 498 were convicted for forced labor. And if we look at the prosecutions, they have started to go down. So we're going to see fewer convictions. And of course, COVID is going to have an impact on that as well. And if we look at the victims identified through official channels, it's 118,000, which out of 40 million doesn't even come to 1%. So there's a 99.98% chance of impunity and a 99% chance of not getting identified. Those are the figures to remember. And that is why this crime is so prosperous. And if we took the UK, for example, where I was commissioner, if we look at systems, it has a national referral mechanism required under the Council of Europe Convention. But if we look at statistics and figures, the people going into that system who reach out for help, there was just under 11,000 in 2019. Yet at the end of the year, there were more people waiting for a decision than had entered into the year because of a backlog from previous years. And this year going forward, there will be in the region of 15 to 16,000 people waiting for a decision, some as many as 2 or 3 years, as to whether they are a victim of human trafficking and modern slavery. When I was a police officer, we would make decisions about other issues, whether someone was a victim of rape or child abuse or serious crime or burglary or robbery, normally within minutes, sometimes hours, but always within a few days in a complex case. So why is it taking so long in human trafficking? Is it because there's immigration issues? Very much so. Is it because it's seen as complex? Or is it also because the wrong decision makers are involved? In the UK, for example, it is the Home Office who makes the decisions. This isn't something against the Home Office, but where do they fit in the process of making decisions about whether someone is a victim of crime or whether someone is vulnerable? It's not their work. So I suggested that this should be something that is run with partnership between civil society, the NGOs, the police, and other statutory agencies, including health and also housing, etc., and education, so that everything the victims need, in particular children, can be picked up in that process. But year on year, the list is getting longer and the services are getting fewer. For example, in the UK system, a pregnant woman who is a trafficked woman gets an additional £3 a week. £3 a week on top of her £39. That is the value placed on a pregnant, trafficked woman. And we need to start talking about these issues and asking and holding to account systems and processes. So what is there that is going to make her life better? What is there that's going to help her, if it were the case, to assist in a prosecution? What is going to help her and her child exit their exploitation, even though they've stepped forward and gone for help in a very wealthy country? But if we look at human trafficking and modern slavery, we know, and I'm sure Brian will talk about this, in supply chains, complex as it may be, or in business models. And it can be at grassroots, in car washes and nail bars, which are seen very often in European countries, or in the fields of East Anglia in the UK, or perhaps in Southeast Asia. But also we see it, as we've seen recently, in cocoa supply, in clothing, and in mica. But also we need to be aware, what is the bigger causes of this? And as we are looking for a better climate, something I fully endorse, that means we need more power for batteries. So that means in the Democratic Republic, more children are going down the mines to mine for the materials in the supply chains of companies who are making billions of dollars profit. So we need to start asking where the accountability is. And yes, we need aid projects, we need assistance, but actually we need to be saying to businesses, what is it you are doing? When businesses do their procurement or source their materials, they will have complex processes. They will have teams of people. But when it comes to their supply chain transparency and ensuring that there isn't modern slavery, what do? Who do they have inspecting it? When they do supply chain statements, as required in the UK and now in Australia, what is it those actually contain? And in the UK example, you can actually do a supply chain statement saying you're doing nothing, or it can be a letter or a document that's written very superficially. But you don't have teams on the ground. You don't actually go and check your supply chain, which is what is needed. And if you look in the UK earlier this year, there was an expose about a major trafficking situation in Leicestershire, in the centre of England, where it was identified hundreds and potentially thousands of women in particular and girls were being exploited, making garments for distribution across the world. One of the companies exposed was called Boohoo, and they were subject of an investigation by the police, by the National Crime Agency, by the Gangmasters Labour Abuse Authority, and they commissioned one themselves. All that mentioned there were problems. Boohoo accepted that. But at the end of the year, their shares went up by 40%. They bought high street chains out because of the COVID issues. And now they're saying really nothing has really changed in Leicester. So we need to say, what is the accountability of what is going on in the ground, and who should make that happen? Well, I think it should be governments, but it should be businesses, and policy should make sure of that. If we look here, for example, this is how we can step into the world of human trafficking without knowing it. Last year, before COVID, it was identified that rubber gloves being made for the National Health Service and other healthcare providers were being made at the hands of exploiters and traffic people in Malaysia. And that a charity concert by the Spice Girls, a British girls group, the tops they made for the charity money were made in forced labour and child labour. These supply chains were not being checked and actually ended up being used in events that were about charity or about life-saving. When I spoke about the rubber gloves to the International Council of Nursing, when they held their event in Singapore, when there's 20 million representatives of that group, they were absolutely outraged that the hands that were being exploited were the very hands that were making the gloves for them to wear in operating theatres or in life-saving situations. But also, when we come to sex trafficking, in London alone, these were operations that I led as a police officer. There was one organised gang making £20,000 a day. £20,000 a day out of trafficking women and girls. And these were coming from all over the world, but mainly Eastern Europe. And they were keeping them in high-end premises, and their customers were plenty. And of course, running operations like this, you require lots of resources. But sometimes the resources you need to think about in a strange way. And as this is the Knights of Malta, it's very pleasing to be able to say that it was religious sisters who started a partnership working with me in the Metropolitan Police, who could give a completely different approach. And this was reported on by the media. Because when we would go into these premises, the religious sisters would be able to assist and take the women to safety in their houses with specially trained officers. But this was all professional. It wasn't ad hoc. It wasn't hoping. And on some cases, and in one case in particular, this ended up with the religious sisters helping us in the morning at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And by their assistance and the trust that was formed with the victim, by midday, I had the traffickers in custody. And they had raped one of the victims only that morning. But my job was to pursue the criminals, to find the evidence, to use other things, as Olivia said, not just victim testimony, surveillance, information data, financial evidence, DNA, covert deployments, infiltration, money laundering, all those things I would use in a case, which is why then we were getting over 100 prosecutions a year in London alone. But now across the whole of the UK, there aren't those levels of prosecutions. In fact, they may be only 50% across the whole of the UK. But we had different ways of doing it, working with people who had the asset and the professionalism to make sure we were making a difference, but realizing what each of our job was. As the police, we're not social workers. The religious sisters weren't the police, and they knew that. And when I wanted financial evidence, I went to financial experts, not to a charity or an NGO. When I needed specialist aerial shots, I went to our helicopter division. When I needed DNA, I would go to our forensic teams. And everybody had a role to play, from the statutory and the non-government organisations. And it worked well. Nowadays, I see there's a bit of a mess. Who's doing what? The ingredients are there, but they're being put in the wrong way. So the recipe isn't working. I want to talk about the Santa Marta Group, because this was an unusual project. And in a way, perhaps I'm contradicting what I just said about the ingredients. This was a really strange meeting of bringing police chiefs and bishops and civil society together. And it was Pope Francis who launched it in 2014. But what the Santa Marta Group was about providing the services and what the church could offer. And that was in the membership of the church, but also what asset was there. So the one thing we saw was the church can actually offer accommodation and support and accompaniment. But also, particularly with the Vatican and the level of the Catholic Church being a state, it can use diplomacy. And with organizations like the Knights of Malta and connections to Geneva and the UN, all those become very useful. And starting to educate and raising the awareness in a really effective way. But the real thing about the Santa Marta Group was about trying to get people to use all their asset for what they can do, particularly with the police from my side, reminding police chiefs that it is all your asset, all your covert techniques, all your specialist investigation systems, all your money laundering, use all that. But if you add this additional piece that you can now have from civil society, and in particular with Santa Marta Group from the church, that can be the added, the business sector. Faith groups and faith are big investors. So actually start to think about your investment and where your investment is going. The other thing is the Catholic Church is a big procurer of services. And the G20 has committed to procurement and looking at governments. Obviously, not all countries, and the Vatican certainly isn't a member of the G20. But what we see in Australia is that the Archbishop of Sydney and the Catholic Church in Australia is now looking at its own supply chain. So looking inwards as well, looking at what they're doing. So the Santa Marta Group also was something that brought about SDG 8.7. I had drafted 8.7 and I couldn't get traction. My own government in the UK was very keen to push it forward, but was coming up against obstructions. So I went over to the Vatican, and then with a meeting with Pope Francis, he said he would endorse it and support it. Having him, bearing in mind he was going to launch the SDGs, actually made it happen. And very much with the support of the Pontifical Academy, Argentina, the UK government, and then Ireland and Kenya, we really got all 193 countries to sign up to a commitment of SDG 8.7. So that goal and that target remains. And what we really need to think about is we've committed by 2025, we're going to eradicate the worst forms of child labour and child soldiers. That's only 4 years away. We're nowhere near getting near that target because we haven't focused in as we should. We are not holding accountable those who are playing a role in making money out of trafficking. I believe that there are a number of organisations domestically that have to play a role in ending this. We need to look at it as a crime, a human rights issue, a money-making machine. But unless we have multi-agency approaches, so the justice system, which is police, courts, other access like labour inspectorates, all of those have to have a role to play. But also the unions. They are crucial in this, enabling people to report, particularly in business and in big companies. But we need the health sector because more victims engage with health than with any other sector. But we need local authorities, including the education system, so that it's something that is inbred or integrated into the daily activities that we do. We need the transport systems, business and trade, and civil society. And the reason I want to see this to happen is because we need this integrated into our society. If we looked at things like education, it's not that long ago, particularly here in Ireland, when everybody didn't have the right to education. It was something that if you were of a certain class, you had it. And it's only in the 1967 when education up to the age of 16 became the right of everybody. That's not that long ago, but it's now integrated into a system. It's now there, universally available to whoever you are. And that system is big because it's not just talking about going to school. It's about a whole system of government. It's about governance. It's about further education, and it's developed. If we look at road safety, it wasn't that long ago that many countries didn't have driving licenses. You just bought a car and drove it. But now there's a whole system around road safety, around the tires, around the qualification of the driver, around, alcohol, around speeding, around dangerous driving, around laws, around the quality of the build of a car, around the emissions, all of that, because it's integrated into society at every part. We need to do that with human trafficking and modern slavery. But at the moment, it's a bit of a gimmick in some ways, perhaps not the right term to use, but it needs to be integrated in what the state is doing and what the state shouldn't do. And the accountability needs to be robust. And then the incentives to be not involved in this need to be great, whether that's tax breaks or whether it's just that to do this costs so much that you wouldn't risk doing it. I think we have got a chance to eradicate modern slavery if we take serious steps. And to do that, I think there are a number of steps we need to take. First of all, we need to make sure all governments, as was committed by the G20, which does can have 85% of the world's economy in it, they said they would make sure that their procurement and their business were free of slavery. Well, let's start seeing that happen. What does that mean? Governments spend $1 in every $5 around the world and generate far more. Well, they need to make sure when they're spending our taxpayers' money, so it's our money, that money isn't ending up in the hands of criminals. And that means good, robust procurement systems where they make sure that those who are in a position to do business with and trade have done all they can to make sure that their supply chain is free of slavery. I know criminals operate quickly and they may breach a system just like fraud, just like corruption. But think of the way we approach corruption. It's very positive, as in, if you get involved in it, there's a price to pay. Tainted money. I think we need to go one step further than proceeds of crime. If we had a notion whereby if money was tainted by modern slavery in the commercial sense, it should be taken. It should be stripped from you. And that money should be then used to fund anti-slavery activities, first of all, reparation. At the moment, the world commits less than $1 billion globally each year to modern slavery. Less than $1 billion, yet the criminals are making 150 billion. So if we started to strip that 150 billion and turn that into good money, for example, so much of that is gone out of people's pockets who are working as migrants, working elsewhere. And they would be sending remittances home to their families so their families could live well and go to school, the children. But because the remittances aren't going back, that is then becoming money for criminals. So if we created this notion of tainted money, just think the difference we could make. Olivia spoke about the internet. Well, the internet could be free of exploitation if we made it a requirement of the companies and the businesses. We need to place the law on them to make sure that their networks are free of exploitation and trafficking and other crimes. These are organizations that make billions a year. And when I was recently at the Vatican with the 5 big IT companies, they presented on what they're doing to deal with this challenge. And one was developing an app which was going to parents so that they would know how to advise their children on how to and not to use the internet and how to put in parental controls. I spoke afterwards and I said, you are placing the responsibility of your failure to control the internet onto the parent who has got 5 kids, who is having to work, and some of the most marginalized. You are creating an app for the mother or the father to then take the responsibility for your failings. I said, you should feel disgraced. And how much is that costing? It didn't even get to 6 figures. They need to invest billions on making sure that the internet is safe. This is a highway that they are making money from. If our highways where we live were infested by paedophiles and people trying to pick up our children, we would want to see action. We would call on the government or whoever had responsibility. So let's start asking them to be responsible for the safeguarding of people on the internet. And let's not get locked into the fact that they say it's the freedom of speech. I'm completely behind the human rights and the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression, but that no way includes human trafficking or the exploitation of children. Nowhere near. And we need to be strong about this. I also think international instruments need to be used in the new age. The 1926 Slavery Convention didn't think about the internet or flight or things like that. We need to not perhaps rewrite them because that might take too long, but we need to revamp them, modernize them, make them relevant. I think multilateral agencies need to play their role. The international criminal courts need to be more involved. We need to get the World Food Programme involved, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other parts of the UN, just to make sure that we are having impact. For example, if you are doing trades and the World Bank is involved, they should be demanding that there is no slavery in that supply chain. And if we've got the other thing of tainted money, if it's found, you're going to lose that investment. I also think one of the main things that we need to do, and meetings like today and the leadership of Michel Veuthey and others, particularly from the Knights of Malta and across the world that I see, we need to reset the moral compass. We're learning about that now with COVID. We tried to talk about COVID and every second word was economy. It took us a little bit of a while to realize actually, if you protect the people, the economy will look after itself. But we were looking after the economy first. What we need to do modern slavery and human trafficking is developed and designed by human beings. And we need to make that possibility not a possibility. We're doing it with COVID, with some strict rules and regulations. Sometimes they're draconian, but sometimes they're necessary. But when I think about human trafficking, I always revert back to the people I've met, whether it's the young woman I met, a girl of 14, who was in Italy, in southern Italy, who had been moved or had come all the way to Libya. She had left Eritrea because of fear of rape and exploitation when she had been joined the army, which was mandatory. But when she got to Libya, she was then kept in a connection house and raped every day for 3 months before she had enough money to get on a boat to go across to Italy. And when she arrived, there was nothing for her really. She had such humility. And she was so thankful for the small help she was getting, but her life had been shattered. She told me about seeing people floating in the sea. This was a 14-year-old girl. And then I see the Nigerian woman I met who had leprosy. And she said to me, she thanked us for coming there as the Western world to cure them of leprosy. But she said, now our people are healthy. You're back. And those people are ending up back in Europe or in your countries, and they're being exploited. If they weren't healthy, you wouldn't want them. These were chilling moments. And I think that when you look at supply chains with businesses making millions, when you see governments who are paying lip service to this, now is the time we need to show real leadership. We're 20 years down the line since the Palermo Protocol, and we're not seeing the progress we need to. And we need to have honesty. Unless we look at ourselves, unless we look at what the problem is, we will never come up with a solution. And sometimes that means an admission that we're not doing a very good job. It doesn't mean that individuals aren't doing a very good job. Together we might not be. So I think the time is now, the time is right for us really to take a look at what we're doing and what we're achieving, perhaps to reset so that the next 10 years of the SDGs are really meaningful. So by the time we get to 2030, perhaps that 14-year-old girl will see a change in the world, and the woman in Nigeria, we can tell her that actually we've done our best to stop this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Today, my presentation will focus on the value of the International Trafficking in Persons report and the trafficking in persons situation in Central America and the Caribbean. With over 27 million and counting individuals that are enslaved globally, human trafficking continues to receive increasing international attention, yet countless traffickers are simultaneously continuing to evade arrest, prosecution, and conviction. The Palermo Protocols was established to prevent, suppress, and punish traffickers, and to supplement the transnational organized crime protocols. And this has very much shaped the thinking of the international community. Additionally, the United States contributed to this framework by legislating the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the subsequent Human Trafficking in Persons report. This international report is an annual report that lays out basically the measures which governments are expected to have in place to eliminate human trafficking. It ranks approximately 188 countries and attempts to hold them accountable. The rankings of the report is based on a three-tier ranking. Tier 1 is the highest ranking that a government can be afforded for combating trafficking. Tier 2 reflects that some countries' governments are taking action, but they do not fully comply. The Tier 3 watch list speaks to the fact that these governments do not fully comply. but has taken significant effort to do so, while Tier 3 is given to countries whose governments don't really comply. The TIP report continues, however, to be the most important tool that is used internationally to bring governments to the table and encouraging them to prioritize human trafficking. This is especially important in the cases of the Caribbean and Central America, where governmental action on the issue of combating trafficking remains very weak. However, the economic consequences of international bad press and a negative TIP report ranking has a tendency to lead countries towards implementing anti-trafficking measures. And now turn my attention to looking at human trafficking in Central America. Central America consists of 7 countries: El Salvador, Costa Rica, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. It is an impoverished region with rife with gang violence and human trafficking. It is the 3rd largest crime industry in the world, and also is a major source of migrants heading towards the United States. Human trafficking in Central America has some pretty deep roots, especially in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and in recent times in Belize. Belize has now become a major transit point from Guatemala onto Mexico, onto the US border. And what we are seeing is that as a result, it requires significant law enforcement effort in the region if we are to dismantle the trafficking networks. However, that remains a work in progress. In Central America, there are a number of domestic and intra-regional routes in which the flow of traffic goes, and it tends to follow the economic path. Wherever there's the possibility of improving my economic law, you will see that the traffic persons tend to travel that route. As I said just now, the largest route tends to be towards the United States. Human trafficking is undertaken by a number of individuals in Central America, which range from criminal gangs to individuals to large organizations. And in many cases, immigration, police, and other civil servants are deeply involved in the trafficking process, from providing false documents or to leaking information to the traffickers. And this is an issue that is fundamental that states must address if we are going to combat the crime. Deal with your officials. Many Central American countries have yet to arrest or prosecute any of their officials with respect to human trafficking. So Central America, the Caribbean, and the protocols. In the past 20 years, all countries in Central America and the Caribbean have become party to the UN Convention Against Trafficking and the protocols to prevent and suppress and punish trafficking of persons. The protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air has also been signed by most countries, yet even after these countries have become signatories, many of them are not compliant with international standards. Many of them are yet to enact or to revisit the national legislation with respect to trafficking. It remains a highly demanding process for these countries. And both for the Caribbean and Central America, the COVID-19 pandemic has compounded this issue. And it seems that a lot of the traffickers are actually operating with impunity. Although trafficking is a significant problem, the United States has sought to continue to try to have proper diplomatic relations with Central American states in the hope that multilateral cooperation will be an effective tool to combat trafficking in persons. The United States has indeed signed the Managua Extraordinary Declaration, which contains many measures that seek to address the issue across border of trafficking. Further to that, in 2019, the United States North Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act was enacted, and this brought about some measures which seeks to provide some $577 million in foreign assistance in the hope that these countries that have signed on to the agreement will in fact have enough resource capacity to combat trafficking. Yet, we do not see the progress that we would hope to see 20 years on from these countries signing the Palermo Protocol, or for the amount of resources that have been sent their way by the United States, Canada, and other international organizations and countries. I will now turn my attention to the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a vibrant and diverse region with dynamic migration flows. Caribbean countries serve as origin, transit, and destination states for irregular migration, and the trafficking of human beings now is of growing concerns. The CARICOM heads of government, which is 15 Caribbean countries, the Caribbean community, in 2018 took particular attention on the issue of trafficking and had asked that a study be conducted on human trafficking in the region. Yet much has not been done since the call for the study, which was completed in 2019. In the Caribbean, unlike Central America, trafficking is a silent crime. Most every government in, especially the English-speaking Caribbean, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago because of the Venezuela issue, there is a denial that human trafficking exists, and as a result, it continues to grow unchecked. The recruitment tactics of the traffickers tend to involve fellow nationals, sometimes former victims themselves. There are trafficking gangs, but a lot of persons are also trafficked by individuals. A lot of the trafficking recruitment is often done more and more online with the advertisements of jobs or the advertisement of other services. And so the issue of technology is becoming a real important concern for countries. And it is critical that member states of CARICOM come up to speed with the use of the technology by traffickers, because law enforcement and government officials in general tend to be behind in knowing about the technology. And if you don't know sufficiently about the technology, you cannot combat the crime. Another issue of great concern is that the judges and the courts in general are not very much aware of the international legislation that exists to deal with human trafficking. And additionally, the national legislation in most states relatively weak. The victim often is expected to prove that they're not a victim, according to how the legislation is built up. Also, you will find that unless a victim is willing to testify despite other physical evidence, the human trafficking cases don't go forward. So with the exception of the exception of the Bahamas and Jamaica, we are yet to have a conviction in the Caribbean on human trafficking 20 years on. Since 2013, in Barbados, a case involving human trafficking has been stuck before the courts. All countries in the Caribbean are party to the protocols and have modeled their national legislation relative to the protocols. However, we see varying varying efforts by the member states to implement. Corrupt government officials and organized crime continues to limit the capacity of the government. There also is a lack of will to do, and this is not helping in the fight against trafficking. The Venezuela conundrum. There is a current estimate of over 100,000 Venezuelan refugees and migrants moving through the Caribbean unchecked. Many of them are undocumented, and most Caribbean states do not have in place procedures or legislation for asylum, and therefore we are finding these people being very, very vulnerable to the traffickers. There is yet, despite a regional framework for crime and security, which was established in 2005, there is yet to be in place a regional strategy for dealing with the issue of the Venezuelans. We are also seeing that despite the COVID situation, there is an increasing movement in some countries, despite the closure of borders in some countries. And because of the redirection of national focus on COVID-19, there is a lack of willingness almost by the member states of the Caribbean to pay any further attention to human trafficking. We are also increasingly seeing those who are trapped within the borders of Caribbean states. We're now seeing modern day slavery, much labor exploitation, sexual exploitation happening. It's becoming much more visible as we operate in lockdowns in the Caribbean. In terms of the U.S. and Caribbean relationship on human trafficking, the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative is a shared security partnership which was established in 2010. It allows the United States government to support the efforts of Caribbean states to deal with human trafficking and other crimes. It is also supported by the United States Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act of 2016. This complements the security pillar of the U.S. Caribbean 2020 multi-year strategy, which aims to improve citizen security and improve crime prevention. In recent times, the Caribbean has received a significant amount of funds from the U.S. government in the hope that we can combat the crime effectively, but we are not seeing the positive results to go along with the money that has been provided to the states. In conclusion, Central America and the Caribbean and the wider international community has indeed come a long way since the adoption of the Palermo Protocols and the the Trafficking in Persons report of the U.S. These instruments are very important, and they have indeed worked to increase awareness surrounding the problem of human trafficking. And it has given the international community the necessary standards for which states can benchmark to address the crime. Despite this fact, there is substantial room for improvement in both the Palermo Protocols and the Trafficking in Persons report, because the Palermo Protocols does not have sufficient teeth, to provide for effectively combating the crime, while the Trafficking in Persons report does go a bit further in trying to do so. Ultimately, the nation state's legislation, political will, resource capacity, and stakeholder engagement will play an effective role in the prevention, prosecution, and protection measures that these member states have put in place. There must be also important steps taken towards providing a victim-centered approach to build this into the national legislation of the member states, because this is a missing and a key part of the treatment of traffic victims in Central America and the Caribbean, because most states do not have anything in place to deal with the victim after they've been to the court or between the period of repatriation to their homelands. There really needs to be a victim-centered approach taken. So with that small bit, I turn over to you. I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak.
And actually calling for this moral reset, I think it's very much in line with Pope Francis' call, repeated calls. And I hope we can also discuss that further in the discussion. And now it's my great pleasure to ask Brian Islin, the founder of the Geneva-based non-profit organization Slave Free Trade, to speak also about his own personal experience and especially, I think, about the supply chain. Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Michel. Let me start by saying that everything Olivia and Kevin have said is absolutely true. Spot on. I fully support their observations. I've been asked to talk about supply chains, but in fact, I'd like to use my time to take you on a slightly different journey. We'll end up in supply chains, as we always do, but a brisk walk on the road, less traveled, perhaps. Maybe the less popular view, too, to be frank, but perhaps a different view, a different way to think about the Palermo Protocol 20 years on. So I've been working on human trafficking since the day 2 decades ago when I opened a sports bag and found 2 baby girls in it, one dead. They were being trafficked for adoption. And almost every day since, I've been reminded of and distressed by globally poor results, lack of improvement, a universal lack of genuine outcomes, the things that Kevin and Olivia have mentioned. I've been working with law enforcement and intelligence agencies on the problem of human trafficking in almost 50 countries since the turn of the millennium. Every time, every new location is Groundhog Day. It's the same questions, the same problems, the same barriers, and the same lack of results. Now, given the Groundhog Day analogy, it won't surprise anyone to hear me say that, frankly, when I started in this field 20 years ago, things were actually not very different. And although in just a few ways, also actually very different. At the turn of the millennium, when Palermo was newly inked, there was far less money, in fact almost none, for countering human trafficking. There was far less media attention, again, almost none. The anti-trafficking community, so to speak, was hugely fewer people than it is now, and there were vastly fewer actual organizations specializing in it, and now there are thousands and thousands. Palermo, at the turn of the millennium, was new. Everyone wanted to give this beast a run for its money. It was shiny. Palermo was in fact quite mesmerizing, and with almost a record entry into force, it started all rather well, actually. So at that time, there was a very strong focus on seeing what this little machine could do. There was hope in the community. But there was a catch. There was actually precious little in the way of analysis of what a focus on what was actually in the protocol might mean. Was the focus on what's in the protocol wise? What would be left undone but when we're looking into the protocol? And what could be done about what's being left undone? And that, in a nutshell, was our very own undoing. Fast forward to 2021, and a global billion-dollar industry has grown around the protocol and human trafficking. Rescues, awareness raising, foundations and funds, multi-stakeholder initiatives, training and education, victim support, and rehabilitation. Where there were early responses to human trafficking after Palermo, noting that at the turn of the millennium they were few and far between any actions at all, there was even then a preponderance of focus on law enforcement or criminal justice responses. When we actually started very quickly, what we actually started very quickly seeing around the world was less a response to human trafficking as a phenomenon, and not everybody will agree with me here, but quite simply a response to the Palermo Protocol. Palermo was the magnet and everyone was metal. We were drawn to it. So globally, our responses to human trafficking very, very quickly, arguably within a year or two, became less problem-oriented, less looking at exploitation, and more, let's say, Palermo-flavored. For example, Australia's very first response to Palermo in 2004 was more than 95% law enforcement. It was 100% focused on sexual exploitation. It was 100% supply-side measures. There was no human rights mentioned, and likewise, no education money. And 20 years on, although the budgets have got larger, that's largely the state of the world today. The budgets have bloated hundreds and even thousands of times since then. Awareness-raising campaigns, public service announcements, poster campaigns, celebrity ambassadors even. The industry is really swinging, let's say, but we've got to ask ourselves to what end. Perhaps one big difference between now and then is that both Hollywood and philanthro-capitalists have jumped into the scene. Cashed up funds, Liam Neeson movies. Unfortunately, they're just bloating and distorting. The arrival of money is always welcome, don't get me wrong. But without regard to effectiveness, we may as well be back where we were 20 years ago with no money in our wallet. One of the biggest changes I've seen over those 20 years is the shift in language away from Palermo. In 2001, it was considered confusing to talk about slavery and servitude in the old way. The talk of the town was human trafficking, and it was, at the time of its coming out, massively overshadowed by a focus on people smuggling. The OECD member states, particularly Australia, for example, were up in arms about people smuggling. It was all people smuggling. So Palermo did successfully put the term human trafficking on the agenda. It took some years to build up a head of steam, but within 10 years, even the Bali process had become about human trafficking. Now, we can debate forever whether introducing the language of human trafficking was needed or useful. It is what it is. It came out. I would explain the language shift since then to broaden it out, bringing in terms like modern slavery as an attempt to view the same base issues of systematic exploitation of someone's labor, what we all think we understand when we talk about human trafficking, just through a wider lens, a lens wider than Palermo. From day one in the field investigating human trafficking, you realize how desperately narrow it is and hard to enforce. It was not long after we all started talking about what is human trafficking, and this is only 20 years ago we were using these sorts of phrases in police training, that we all started to see how complicated it was to see in the real world. The sheer number of ways in which the phrase, the concept, let us down in an operational sense, perhaps paved the way towards this broadening out. And to be frank, I'm completely supportive of the broadening out. Trying to introduce at that time what was considered a completely new term into so many countries and cultural contexts all at once, give it not just legal shape, but a character that could be distinguished from other conditions in the real world, is a difficult and arguably Sisyphean task. In the very same workplace, there can be victims of child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, and slavery and servitude right alongside each other. In fact, one victim can also be a victim to all of those at once. In everyday terms, the distinction between someone trafficked for forced labor and someone in forced labor who was not trafficked is completely abstract when you think about it, and very much only matters in the eyes of the beholder. The distinctions between murder, manslaughter, and culpable driving are a bit academic for the one that's lying in the morgue. So this is where we started seeing the more umbrella, modern slavery come into more common usage, at least outside the US. And to be frank, I think we have the UK, and Kevin in particular, to thank for that. It might just be that if we took an historical lens to it, the Palermo Protocol was actually hamstrung before drafting even started. Most of you would be aware of the history of the drafting of the protocol, the venomous split between the pro-prostitution and abolitionist lobbies, sliced clean through the ability of poor old Palermo to live a full and rewarding life. If drafting started in tumult, these two lobby groups not talking to each other, it ended in complete rancor. So right from that moment, whatever we expected of poor Palermo was probably going to be over-expected. Palermo's the kind of forlorn child torn between parents, never able to please everyone at the same time. Law enforcement treaty, not human rights treaty. Punitive focus, not protective focus, supply reduction focus, not demand reduction focus, sexual exploitation focus, not all forms of exploitation focus. And so after working on this for so long and finding close to zero comfort in the results we were seeing, I decided it was time to have a good hard look at what we were doing and why, and what we could do better. So I started from a blank page. Nothing short of revisiting our initial assumptions will save us from perpetuating flawed responses. Taking Thoreau's advice, the best way to correct the mistake is to make it right, right? The very first point to note is that nobody had bothered to learn the lessons from the illicit drug experience, or indeed of pretty much any other illicit market we ever encountered. Before I started working on human trafficking, before I opened that sports bag, I was a counter-narcotics specialist working in China, Mongolia, and North Korea. We did not take the lessons from other illicit market experiences. And the very first thing the world forgot when Palermo came out is that illicit markets are driven much more by demand than by supply. And it makes the world of difference. In public policy terms, acknowledging trafficking as a response to demand changes the way we understand cause. It changes the cause. Poverty and other circumstances constitute vulnerability factors that put individuals at risk for being trafficked. But in an illicit market, they don't constitute cause. In Nietzsche's exposition on causation, vulnerabilities are these small forces that shove a boat out into the river. They are not, however, the source of the river. So since poor Palermo, the bulk of the world's counter-trafficking measures are focused on limiting these factors in supply countries where the causal demand remains neglected. Law enforcement can help reduce demand for illicit products, of course, but not if it's being directed to exclusively focus on supply-side activity. So why are we so fixated on supply, and how did that end up screwing us up on cause? The simplest explanation is actually logical error. There's a common flaw in logic. It's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy that defines the bulk of the world's responses to human trafficking. The almost exclusively supply-side focus is post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because most people are poor before being trafficked, does not make poverty the cause. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of people in poverty are not trafficked. It is not a cause. The same applies to other vulnerability factors. These are often called push factors, such as domestic violence, being in prostitution, lack of citizenship, age, proximity to crime clusters, ethnicity, etc. I'm not implying by any of this to say that supply-side measures are a waste. I have a law enforcement background. I'm completely criminal justice background. So I strongly believe in supply-side measures. They're not a waste, but as we can also see in all the other illicit markets, supply-side measures alone cannot solve trafficking because the market will remain regardless of what we do with supply. Sources of supply, humans in this case, are so plentiful, cheap, and so little restricted to any one country or region, it's impossible to affect an illicit market sufficiently by tackling only the supply end. Supply-side measures in illicit markets can limit push factors, but they serve more to displace traffic. When law enforcement operations displace a criminal organization, it's a displacement of the traffic. It's not changing the market dynamics. It's not changing the dimensions of the market, and it's not creating fundamental change in the global problem. The reasons for the post-Palermo fixation on the supply side of trafficking are they're pretty numerous and quite complex. But this post hoc ergo propter hoc, seeing trafficking as determined by sequence, that poverty and other vulnerability is followed by recruitment and trafficking, is one reason. That's a reason for our fixation on the supply side. Poor Palermo was also not even allowed to go down the demand path. It was kept squarely in the supply side lane during the drafting wars between pro-prosecution and abolition, and it stayed there. Very little reference to demand. Demand is almost, as you read it, it's like, and don't forget demand. Importantly also, demand countries, let's say OECD, prefer not to criticize their own laws and institutions. Political reality is such that the most powerful governments need the international community to accept their prevailing understanding of what trafficking is and what drives it, because it both excuses the failure of national and international efforts against trafficking, and yet At the same time, it's tricky, it justifies their expansion. This is a very old, let's say even Roman, strategic planning play. It's called the more troops gambit. This is where bureaucrats that run responses to threats, like human trafficking, for example, and politicians, of course, they first engineer a switch to a war rhetoric. You've all seen this, the tough talk. War on trafficking, combat trafficking, crackdown, it's all very tough language, right? Then they declare that the lack of troops has created the failure to respond to this, and more troops will define success. And remember that bureaucracies exist to self-perpetuate. So most governments seek responses that can be implemented in a 3-year term, transmitted in a 20-second soundbite, and the impact of which will never be measured. So declaring a war on trafficking will never lose someone an election. And if it fails to secure results, more troops gambit. It needs more troops. So many countries have fallen into a rather, let's say, circular trap because of Palermo. Maybe not because of Palermo, but certainly especially since Palermo. When tackling trafficking, we tend towards punitive approaches because of our reliance on law enforcement. Let's face it, the Palermo Protocol is a law enforcement tool. As the leading tool that was developed to tackle human trafficking, though, the Palermo Protocol then became the golden hammer. When all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And it's so too with trafficking. If the leading international instrument you have for defining and addressing the concept is a law enforcement treaty, not a human rights treaty, not a migration treaty, it's a law enforcement tool, everything starts to look like a law enforcement problem. In relying on law enforcement responses, we fail to take account of the shortcomings. As I say, I'm a law enforcement background. I died in the wool law enforcement, but all the talk about intelligence-led policing, most law enforcement is about mopping up spilt milk. Experience from tackling other illicit markets demonstrates that law enforcement alone is a manifestly unsuccessful model for reducing or eliminating an illicit market. It's got to be there, but it will never do it on its own. There are not now and never will be enough police resources to pursue enough trafficking cases to make a difference. To think otherwise is just simply based on a misunderstanding of what law enforcement can achieve on a crime like this. The single most compelling reason, though, that law enforcement should not be the leading tool against human trafficking and comes from one simple figure, 0.01%. This is the percentage of global estimated cases for trafficking, forced labor, child labor, etc., that might be considered resolved. It's a dreadful number, despite the billions that we're now spending on it. When your golden hammer is a law enforcement treaty, law enforcement is what you do. So let's start thinking beyond Palermo, is my point. The various shortcomings and unsatisfactory outcomes of Palermo, of the Palermo world, caused me to set up a demand-side organization, a behavioral one called Slave-Free Trade. You can see it on the wall behind me. So at Slave-Free Trade, what we're trying to do is shake everything up, actually. We revisit what success would look like, and then we build behavioral positivist solutions to achieve that. Going into the Palermo Protocol drafting, what was on the table was a tool to rid the world of exploitation of the labor of other people. What we ended up with was not that. For me, success against human trafficking is really, really simple. A reduction in the number of workplaces in the world where people are exploited. I don't know whether you've seen the Eastwood movie, The Unforgiven. His character in that, William Money, unambiguously revealed the heart of demand-side measures when he said, you can't buy flesh. So success to me, and what was there before the protocol, before Palermo was drafted, looks like a market characterized by goods and services where flesh has indeed not been bought but freely hired. A market in which only free labor has gone into the product. Success for me is something poor Palermo can never give us. That's a world free from exploitation. Only we can do that, and that starts with identifying our own role in it. I preached a lot, Michel. I'm sorry, but I just...
No, you preach well. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Actually, thank you for sharing your field experience and work through your human rights intelligence platform. And actually, I think it's very good that you are pointing the finger at supply chains, and that way everyone, including consumers, could play a role in preventing and combating human trafficking. And now I would like to ask Morgane Nicot. Morgane Nicot, you are UNODC Criminal Justice Officer, and you agreed to play the role of discussant. So I'll let you now play this role, and thank you again for being with us tonight. Morgane,
yes, thank you very much. I think my microphone is on. I'd like to check that you can hear me. Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for this extremely rich contribution so far in the first hour and 15 minutes of this webinar. I think we've heard a lot from various perspectives, and I think that's very important to open this first in a series of looking into prosecution of trafficking in persons cases, the efficiency, and how the protocol 20 years after its adoption is relevant or not. And I think that's an interesting conversation. And I will to start, I will summarize some of the points, maybe flag some of the things I've heard to give some context to the discussion. I've seen as well that we have a couple of questions already in the chat or the Q&A. Please do feel free to put your questions there so that we will pick them up and, of course, direct them to our presenters. So we've heard about prosecution, but not only, actually, we've heard much more than that. And I think that's what's really important and interesting here. So I will get back to that. We are talking about the protocol. It's a protocol, yes, that dates back 20 years ago, and a protocol indeed, which is supplementing an instrument which is for the collaboration in order to tackle crimes. And this collaboration is mainly envisaged from the law enforcement side, as Brian reminded us. That's the reality of the framework. What we can see is we have these 178 states parties to date, I believe, which is actually a very large, let's say, a number of states parties, and the convention itself is 190 states parties, I think. So we're close to universal ratification. So indeed, it's interesting to wonder how have these instruments been useful to states and to tackle the crimes that they're supposed to be tackling, and also to address the problems that the victims are facing, and also ensure the prevention that is absolutely necessary to put an end to this type of crimes. So indeed, the emphasis of this instrument and its implementation has been on having a legal framework in place so that measures could be taken by the justice system to combat the impunity that was perceived, and I think rightly so, for those involved in trafficking in persons in its various forms. As these negotiations often happen, we see that there are disagreements that Brian also very correctly reminded us of, different views, and there's a lot of negotiation. And we ended up with an internationally agreed definition of trafficking in persons, which is complex and very difficult to implement. As a reason, us as UNODC, for those who don't know, UNODC is actually the part of the UN Secretariat, which serves as the Secretariat of the Conference of the Parties to the UNTOC and its protocols. So we're very much involved at various levels, at the political level for the intergovernmental processes, the resolutions that may be adopted both in the Conference of the Parties to these instruments or the General Assembly in New York when it comes to adopting a global plan of action on trafficking, or to include in the Global Compact on Migration, for example, sections on trafficking in persons, or smuggling of migrants, of course. But we also deliver technical assistance and try to build the knowledge and understand what's happening with the implementation, as well as what are the challenges, the obstacles which are being faced in order to have a proper criminal justice response to this crime. And again, I will go back to that. This is not the only way, and it should not be the only way. We need a holistic approach. That is something that we can, I think, all fully agree on. Now, the instruments we have are what they are and are not enough, as we've heard also from Dr. Smith and Hyland before. Yet, of course, I need to defend it. In our view, they have the merit of existing and, let's say, bringing a common understanding of what this crime means and looking at the whole chain of perpetration. So not only at the end result and the exploitation, but everyone who was involved in making it possible to exploit those victims. We have actually, and we continue working on each and every word of the definition almost. We've been looking at the means. What are these means? How do people influence, control, including through subtle means, the victims of trafficking? How can they end up themselves becoming defendants in trafficking cases, for example? How do the psychological dimension actually play a role there too? This is complex. This is not satisfactory. We often have questions about, and I echo what Brian just said, why should we look into trafficking and try to prosecute trafficking when it's so much easier to establish forced labor? Well, I think it really depends on the jurisdiction you're in as well. Some jurisdictions have a lot of means in place, and still the results may still be lagging. Some others have very little. So what we've seen is, we've heard from Dr. Smith her views on what I believe is the US report on trafficking in persons, which is coming from the US Department of State. So it's one country which is assessing the performance of other countries in their response to trafficking. This is extremely useful and full of information that I think give us a good view of what's happening. We at UNODC, at the UN, we have a global report on trafficking in persons, which is very different. Very different, maybe less useful, but what's interesting is that it shows the extent of this implementation. And what we've seen is, first of all, we collect data from states. So it shows the level of response at the criminal justice level by states to trafficking in persons, meaning how many people have been detected in terms of victims, how many investigations and prosecutions have taken place, and how many people have been convicted for trafficking in persons, whichever type of exploitation. These figures are very low. But what we've seen, and this is encouraging in a way, is that there's been slow progress, but from the moment we've heard Dr. Smith mentioning weak legislation, for example. We saw that from the moment, I'm sorry, am I frozen? Yeah, okay, I'm back. From the moment states started adopting legislation that were covering different types of exploitation, different types of control, including the subtle means, which are not using force, for example. We slowly saw more and more detection of various forms of exploitation, including of different gender and different ages as well, because in some countries it was clear that the focus was on sexual exploitation of women and girls, for example. So we didn't see anything on forced labor of boys because there was no focus on this. But then a national plan of action was adopted, etc. So slowly, there's been a change. So we have seen things change, and we should not forget that this is an international instrument which is really broadly has a very broad geographical coverage. So the interests of some of the states and the means they have are very different. So we also need to acknowledge that. Yet, I think what's really interesting, and I mentioned it before, is this global compact on migration, which has also brought everyone around the table on more holistic perspective on migration. So that means that it does not cover all trafficking cases, obviously. That would be the transnational cases, because we know that trafficking happens across borders, but also within the same territory. And this, I think, we should not forget. Our report actually showed that half of the victims detected by the national authorities in 2018 or more recently were domestic victims. So in that sense, it's obvious that not only an instrument like UNTOC or protocol would be useful, but we really need to see it through other lenses, not only migration, etc. So what we've heard here, I think, is essential in terms of we need to bring our forces together. We need to not only have the law enforcement, but we need to have the civil society. We heard of faith-based organizations, which really have a role to play. And I think this is what we've seen more and more as well, is more inclusion of the civil society, more inclusion of evidence-based knowledge to respond to the actual reality of what's happening and not some form of fantasy or image we have of what trafficking could be. And I think that's very important too. And of course, we've heard, and Kevin also flagged it a few times, that there was a huge actor which was not really part of the equation, especially at the beginning when the protocol was signed and ratified and adopted. The onus was on states. That was really what was the focus. Now we see that obviously there are multi-million international companies which have huge means to do something about it, but they need to make a commitment. Accountability is essential. We've also started working on these issues on public-private partnerships in trafficking in persons. And what we keep on hearing is the private sector is not really interested. They need incentives. Which incentives can we give them? And I think this is a very important question. I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think that's the thinking we need to have. And that's something that we've heard about, moral accountability. It's not only about the money, but when you have it, you need to place it in the right place and trying to find systems to ensure that not only are the consumers fully aware of what happens along the supply chains for the products they buy, but that this accountability is actually guaranteed through a proper monitoring of what's happening along the chain. So if of course it's happening in countries away from the countries which are consuming these goods, there must be something in place to make it happen. And that can happen both at the international level. There are initiatives that we know of, but probably at the regional level, it will be very, very strong, as well as the national level. We need to really look at all these different levels. Some things are much easier to do at the regional level because there's a commonality in the culture, in the type of problems which are being faced, etc. So it's also something to envisage. I just want to quickly go through my notes because it was so rich. I'm sure I will forget quite a few extremely important points. Or maybe what I would do at this point, we have half an hour left. I've seen a couple of questions. I will pick them. As I told you, invite you to ask further questions if you wish. And if you're okay with this, dear presenters, I will then direct to you the questions we have. And of course, if one or the other of presenters want also to contribute, please let me know. I wrote a question from Andrea Broghi, I think for Kevin. Kevin, you mentioned, and actually I'm also interested in that, you mentioned that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, could play a role in the prosecution of trafficking in persons cases. Would you be able to tell us more about that? How you see the role of the ICC in this combat? You may be frozen right now. Maybe, Kevin, we can't hear you right now. Maybe you can join.
I think you might be able to hear me now.
You are, yes, please, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Good. Yeah, I think the international criminal courts could play a role. If we actually look at some countries, there is about state-sponsored human trafficking. When we look at things like, where children are exploited as part of the economics of a country. And we need to look at what role the international criminal courts can play. And that's the only way we're going to see change. We need to look as well at where sanctions are effectively used. we see the Tariff Act, in the US has been used, quite extensively, but not as much as it could have been. We talk about incentives, why we need to do this as well. That if you don't take this seriously, just like corruption and, the fact that we have such strong rules and laws, governance internationally about corruption and bribery, that businesses have to take positive steps to not be involved in corruption. And I think is we really need to step up the professionalism in this agenda. We really need to put this where it needs to be. Local projects, local action is necessary, and communities are crucial, particularly when it comes to identifying victims and providing local support. But actually, some of the things that we do, like we want to set up an international network or an international reporting center, we have to realize that doesn't work on anything in the world. This kind of thing that we can sort of just set up a small project and deal with a global issue in this way, we're fooling ourselves. What we need to use is some real changing mechanisms that have real impact and change the way that a country has to operate. I know the international criminal courts can be a slow process, but it does actually have incredible sanction and can really kind of change the way a country is governed. If this isn't something that they think it should be in there, well, it does, because it's in the Rome Convention. Slavery and trafficking is in there. So it is something that should fit in the ICC.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That's really interesting, and it's actually a debate or discussion that I have been part of with various organizations. There seems to be an appetite to look into that, and I think we are seeing more and more. You've most likely heard, it's a national jurisdiction, but a case in Germany which is actually looking at this issue of slavery, sexual enslavement in conflict zones. And I think as we see also that trafficking is really a serious issue as well in conflict zones, that the vulnerability to being trafficked for various reasons, for women, for sexual exploitation and enslavement, but also for children in with the armed troops, etc. There's a potential there. As you correctly noted, the process can be long, but it would be worth exploring indeed. Now we have a second question, which would be for Dr. Smith. We have Amélie Boulemont, who is interested in hearing more from you on the Dutch overseas territories in the Caribbean and the situation on trafficking in persons, and in particular for Curaçao and Aruba. Would you like to elaborate a little bit?
If you may repeat the question, please.
Yes, of course. One of the participants, it's also written on the side in the chat. She's asking if she could hear more about the current situation on trafficking in persons in the Dutch overseas territories.
Okay, thank you. Currently in those Dutch areas, there's an increase of the Venezuelan migrant being trafficked to those areas. There's also an increase of Jamaican women being trafficked to Aruba and those places, following a regional trafficking network chain. These girls that end up in those places, like Aruba, they start in Jamaica, they usually come to Barbados, they then travel on to probably St. Martin's and then Aruba, in between there Antigua. But we're seeing the majority are Jamaican girls and Venezuelan migrants. I also would want to pick up a bit. I hope that answers that question sufficiently. But I'll just like to add a bit to Kevin's response just now and his question. Besides looking at the international strategies for combating this crime, human trafficking is a transnational crime, and therefore it is necessary for us to strengthen multilateral cooperation wherever possible within the regions themselves on the issue. Also, looking at a question I saw in the sidebar, we cannot take a one-size-fit-all approach to looking at mechanisms for combating crime, because as the person said, one of the important issues that we have to address are the cultural realities. Because in Latin America and the Caribbean, how the Indian community, the Chinese community, African descent communities view the issue, the issue of treatment of the victim, being a victim, and responding to law enforcement and all those issues. The cultural realities are very, very important when looking at combating the crime.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Would anyone else like to intervene? Otherwise, I will take the next question. No? Okay. I have here a question from Imelda Poole, who is asking, if you were launching a new anti-modern slavery alliance today, representing all disciplines working against human trafficking, what would be your first objective? There's a second question. How would you implement positive behavioral solutions with the troops gathered? Thank you. So what would be your first step? And then how would you implement positive behavioral solutions? Who would like to suggest a first step? If launching
I'm happy to have a go at that.
Please.
Well, in fact, I mean, that's what I did 4 years ago when I started Slave Free Trade, right? The idea was, let's start rethinking all of these things. Let's see what would work on modern slavery. How can we reduce exploitation of people for the things that we're working on? There are a lot of people not at the table, I should say, on modern slavery that really can play a role. So let me give you a very good example. I'd come back from missions completely exhausted, emotionally exhausted, physically exhausted, have deep conversations with a lot of people needing to vent, right? And those people would be wringing their hands. Some of them were even put off their meals. But the next day they'd be back at H&M, or they'd be back at Zara buying the same clothes that they were buying the day before. And a part of the problem we have is that we are not communicating to people in a way that they can genuinely take action in a timely way based on the information we give them. So you see a press release that says there's 152 million, UNICEF says there's 152 million children in child labor. People will wring their hands when they read that, but there is nothing they feel they can do about it. There's this thing called cognitive dissonance, which sets in 7 seconds after such a pronouncement if there's no immediate action that can be taken. So 152 million children in child labor, that's a terrible thing. No action can be taken. It goes to the back of the brain because we can't function as humans if we keep that at the front of the brain. The dissonance is a protective mechanism. So that all changes completely if you give every individual or an individual an action they can take, a small, cheap, easy action they can take within seconds of seeing the information. So this is where I talk about behavioral responses. This is what one of the things Slave Free Trade is doing. So, a sign on an investment on the New York Stock Exchange to say that's a human rights compliant company. Investors interested in human rights compliant companies, not interested in spending on exploitation, know within seconds that that's a company that they can invest in safely. Same for a chocolate bar on the shelves that is slave free. The consumer can see immediately this is a slave free product. Admittedly, you can't trust what's out there at the moment, but very, very soon you will be able to see in an app, you'll be able to see that chocolate bar actually is guaranteed human rights compliant through the supply chain, and then you can buy it. So it's really important if you're going to talk about behavioral responses, to identify which audiences can play a role: ethical consumer, ethical investor, public procurement agency, and then you deliver to them the decision intelligence they need to change their buying decision. And every single one of those very small micro actions, the consumer choosing that chocolate bar, the investor on the New York Stock Exchange choosing that company over that company, the public procurement agency choosing this bid over those other 4 bids because it's human rights compliant, because they take this micro decision based on accurate decision intelligence, that's a small clap multiplied by millions. This is how we're going to achieve social change. And it's the only way we're going to achieve social change on the kind of scale we need to tackle the problem of 152 million children in child labour.
If I just come in there now, I totally agree with Brian, and I really think that he's example of giving people something to do. And that's really why the climate change was so effective, because there were things brought in that we could all do. Use a recycled cup when we go for a cup of coffee. Not take plastic bags when you go shopping. And, now you'd be frowned on if you took bags from a supermarket. We did change cultural behavior because we get positive things that people could do. And then obviously there is the requirement of businesses now, to change, and there's going to be big investment. And obviously there's a global conference, the COP26, which is all focusing on climate. And there's going to be billions thrown into that. I mean, absolutely billions thrown into that. And I think the one thing that we need to be realistic about as well is, what is it you're asking, as Brian said, what is it you're asking people to do? What is it that people can do in their community or in their everyday life to make a difference? And we need to be able to make sure they're getting that information, because at the moment it will be, something that is beyond their either ability, interest, or where they would normally behave. You can't say to everybody, phone the police, phone this, phone that every time you see something, because it's everywhere, because people just get exhausted by it. Whereas if you can give them something that they can focus on in their local community, and it has to be information, as Brian says, that's actually evidence-based, that's real in that environment, that people just don't, after hearing it, go, well, that can't be the case. And even when we hear about these big cases like in the UK, of big cases of, big organisations involved in trafficking, like we saw in Leicester, it didn't affect one bit their trade. In fact, it acted as a good advertising, because their sales went up, or their shares went up by 40%, and everybody thought that they would go down. So what is it that those people could be informed about? And a lot of it would be about getting the standards in that local community improved, making sure that those workers are being looked after, making sure you're calling out where the tax breaches are, and the fact that there's bad conditions around fire conditions and prevention of this. It's like, there are all other ways to do it. And I think working that out is important. So if you're talking about an alliance, first of all, an alliance could be too big if you're trying to encompass everything, particularly, say, in the context of, say, the UK, where there are hundreds of organisations involved in this. Look at what your expertise are. Look at where your experience is, where your credibility is, and then start to develop that. But if you get, as I often say, my father was in construction, and he always said, when I talked to him about human trafficking, he said, you're trying to build a house sometimes the way that I see it, and he'd look at it in a different way. He said, it seems to me sometimes people are trying to build a house without putting the foundations down. You're building a house on sand. So you get so far up and it collapses. He said, and even if you start getting the house built, you've got the plumber coming in and do the electrical work. And then when somebody comes along and inspects it, it doesn't get a certification. That's kind of an analogy. We need to have the people, the experts doing what they need to do, all in the right place, doing the right things, getting communities and people involved with what they can achieve, and coming up with some innovative ideas that are meaningful, and not just doing more of the same. When are we going to say that some of the things we've been doing for a long time just haven't worked? And I do agree with a lot of what Brian says. I think there is a role for prosecution, but I completely agree that there's a bigger role for stopping this in the first place. As a police officer, prevention was far better than prosecution, and we prevented things over the years. I can, give you ideas about, when I first joined the police, car theft was enormous. Now it's really hard to steal a car, so cars aren't getting stolen. But that was because of the change of the design of cars and the security and the manufacture. It wasn't because the police got better. So there's a good example. We need much wider thinking about prevention and what that really means and how we engage people in a meaningful way.
Brian, please, and then we'll have Dr. Smith. We can't hear you, Brian.
Classic COVID mistake, leave the microphone off. Yeah, I wanted to just add to what Kevin was saying. There was one very interesting thing is that in the non-profit world, so this, if you talk about a human trafficking alliance, I guess you're talking about starting a non-profit. One of the things to remember there is the non-profit world is no different from the business world. Startups die at record rates. So if you want to start something completely from scratch and do something completely new, there's a huge risk there. It's the startup grind you've got to go through. I would argue that one of the better things to do is get involved in something that exists and try to expand it, grow it, develop it in the directions where your expertise makes sense. And I would also add that one of the things that we need, if we're talking about a problem of the size we're talking, Kevin's alluded a couple of times to the success of the E in ESG, the Environmental Climate Change Lobby. One of their successes is that they've been able to generate movement development, movement building, as opposed to small actions by small actors, and multiplied by, many small actors. What we do, there's a great saying about this. We don't need to solve this. We don't need 100 people doing everything perfectly. We need 1 million people doing everything imperfectly. So the movement building is something that we really need to be focusing much more on. So I would argue if you want to do some sort of a human trafficking alliance, look at some movement building work you could be doing. That's a great place to get involved.
Okay, I'd like to quickly add to that. Being on the ground, having been an immigration officer and currently working Trafficking Foundation, continuously what we've seen is that there's a general lack of public awareness. Members of the public and even law enforcement officials very often do not know what the crime is or even understand the crime. We need to have a large-scale community awareness and international program where we ask the countries to conduct, hold them to a commitment of conducting national level, and then there are international agencies that can conduct these human trafficking awareness, anti-slavery programs, because how can people combat what they do not know or understand? And then the time has really come for international agencies and for governments not to see the media as an enemy, but to partner with international media to sensitize the world about trafficking, get the word out. Who's better to do that than the media? Who's better to do that than those who have the social media platforms? And so public engagement and better training of law enforcement and the relevant officials continue to be two important elements of the fight against trafficking. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back with you. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for your input. I think that it was very nicely complementary, and it also gave me a bit of time to look at the comments. There's plenty of them. They're very positive. They really echo what the three of you have been saying. I think that's a great sign. We have some questions very much on demand supply. And how to address that. But I think we just covered it quite largely. So what NGOs can do specifically, we heard from you, Brian, your own experience, as well as how to tackle the root causes of the problem. Kevin, you mentioned prevention. Dr. Smith, you've actually echoed that as well, talking about the awareness of the wider public, which then we have closing the loop, as Brian was also mentioning that. Prevention needs to intervene at so many different levels. It needs to be done together. And actually, it's something that one of you said earlier on as well. Education, in this sense, I think is also extremely important. So that's why we really need to tackle this issue from a very broad perspective. When we talk about prevention, it's not only crime prevention, it's also addressing the vulnerability to being exploited. What are those? And for this is going into development issues. This is going to go potentially into cultural issues. This is also going into economic issues, because there are some players which have disproportionate power to exploit people in some situations where there's nothing in place to stop them from doing it. So there's so many layers here, so much more to discuss about, but so much more to do as well. And I think, and I'm not saying that really as UNODC, also, is that it's by working together and really, and not only, and that's super important, of course, to have the investigative agencies working together. We heard about follow the money and make sure that the money laundering is also addressed and this and that. But it's also being able to hear and work hand in hand with the NGOs, with the communities, with the people affected, with the people who may be perpetuating some practices as well without realizing that this is happening. So I think, yes, I think that's how I would stop before going the floor back to Michel. I see a few more questions, but I think I'm turning to Michel if you want me to take another one for our presenters, or if I should actually give the floor to you, let me know. Sorry, I can't hear you, Michel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Morgane, for this, and also to all speakers and participants. I just wanted to add one word on this. I think it's what both Kevin and Brian and also you, Olivia, said about having a broad front, having an alliance, having millions. I would just mention two historical examples of last century, meaning that was in 97 and 98, and that was actually one, the Ottawa Convention banning landmines, anti-personnel landmines, and the other one was a global coalition for the ICC, for the International Criminal Court. And both were actually composed of like-minded governments, of international organizations. UNICEF was for the Ottawa Convention, Red Cross and Red Crescent members, ICRC, IFRC, national societies, and individuals. And actually, I would love to see in the near future such a coalition for the abolition of modern slavery and human trafficking. That's just my small contribution. And for the rest, clearly, I would very much like to thank all the speakers, all participants. As you know, we shall meet again next Tuesday. And actually, I'm very happy to see that we have 3 people who will also be with us: Morgane, Nicot, Kevin Hyland, and Brian Islin. And in addition to that, we'll have Ambassador Elizabeth Tichy. She's a very good specialist of human trafficking. She's the Austrian permanent representative in Geneva. And Peter Williams, also from New Zealand. And I think we shall examine what can we do. So, needless to say, we shall continue the very same issue. And I'm very happy to have started this with you today. And clearly, I would like, if you have other questions, we can definitely answer those questions by email. Excuse me to say, but visit also a website. We have a website, christusliberat.org, where you will find best practices and also access to a free online course on human trafficking for helpers, and also the opportunity to register to all future webinars. And actually all our webinars are recorded and they are available on our website at loudertosee.org. And if you wait for a few days, you will find also subtitles in English, and also we'll try to do that also in French, because I see that we had also some people from Africa. But very happy, we had a lot of people registering. We had also an impressive number attending this webinar, and clearly thank you very much to all of you, and especially you, Dr. Smith, Morgane, Kevin, and Brian, and again also to my colleagues and assistants. I think we are together trying to at least achieve something, and possibly one day we could mobilize a large number of people. And I'm pretty sure that Brian, we can still use your energy, and Kevin also your experience, and definitely also Olivia, your witness about what's happening in the Americas and in the Caribbean is quite important. And Morgane, you are doing that every day, actually. So that's very good. And thanks to everyone, and all the best. And hope to see all of you next week, next Tuesday. And also, as you know, we have a third webinar on the 2nd of March, which will be about precisely good practices. And definitely, we hope to go on with the series of webinars. If you have ideas or if you want to participate, please let us know. And now I wish you a very good evening, and all the best to all of you. Thank you.